Everyone. I'd like to go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here today. This is the 12th annual Mass Saves Financial Health and Wellness Summit, and this is our kickoff opening session for that summit. I'm sure many of you I saw at last year's summit, which of course we had in person at the Boston Fed, and this year is obviously very different for us and just about everyone. We have gone virtual, as many conferences have, and in doing so, we've changed the format. So we are having sessions going on throughout the month of October for Financial Planning Month. The theme of this year's summit is Understanding and Reducing Inequalities in Wealth and Income. A couple of things about Midas and a couple of logistical items before we start. We are, in fact, recording this session. This will be available to registered participants of the summit following the summit if you'd like to view it again later. We do encourage you to share the content with your colleagues. We will leave a registration link open for this summit so additional people can be registering throughout the month and have access to the sessions as well as the recorded sessions that they may have missed. So you can please help us out by spreading the word far and wide that the summit is going on this month. We have a slate of amazing speakers booked for the month. Our sessions will be each Tuesday, Mondays and afternoons, and we will be sending out communications in between the sessions to remind folks of the slots that they are booked in, what the session titles are as we go along. So the logistics and everything are very different for this year's summit. We thank you again for participating. We would also like to thank our very generous sponsors. These folks are the reason that Midas is able to put on this summit each year, and they're also the reason that we are able to keep the ticket prices for the summit very low or no cost for those who need it. Our sponsors this year for this summit are Boston Private, Cambridge Savings Bank, JP Morgan Chase, Metro Credit Union, People's United, and Rockland Trust. Midas is a nonprofit, and we are only able to put on programs like this due to the generosity of our sponsors and also from individual donations. Every donation does make a difference to us, and we welcome them so that we can continue to put on programs like this. With that being said, I would like to talk about our speaker that will be coming up in just a minute as soon as I finish talking, which I'm sure you would all like. Hopefully you saw the announcements about Shawn Rochester and the bio that went out also last night in your confirmation emails, as this morning actually, as well as on social media posts. Shawn is a speaker and author of multiple books. Today he is talking about his book, The Black Tax, for our summit in line with our summit theme. Shawn has spoken before he came here today to Midas's Mass Save Summit. Shawn has spoken on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, at leading universities, and the United Nations about the staggering financial cost of discrimination against Black people in America. And he talks about a new economic framework to help create millions of jobs and businesses that are missing from the Black community. Shawn has received citations from the New York State Assembly and the New York City Council for his work on economic development, and he was selected by the International Human Rights Commission Relief Fund Trust, to be listed in its 2019 almanac as one of the top 100 human rights defenders for his efforts to educate people on the financial costs of discrimination, both past and present, against members of the African diaspora in America. So when the planning committee for this summit first started to conceive of what we wanted to talk about this year, we talked about the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, that started earlier this year in the United States and was spreading worldwide, the economic fallout that came from that pandemic. And we had some difficult discussions, frankly, about the impact that it was having and the disparate and unequal impact that it was having on Black and Brown communities in our country. As we were developing the theme for this conference, we sort of morphed from the economic issue to the issue of violence against Black and brown people in our country, physical violence, and the attention that the whole country was paying to incidents that were being reported widely in the media, and then the resulting protests. And in the end, we felt that there was nothing more important than this theme right now, which is the disparate economic impacts, which is what we are going to kick off the summit with today, and we are going to be talking about throughout the month of October. So again, I thank you all for your attention on this very important issue. We hope that the summit not only is an opportunity for you to listen, but also for you to participate. We have encouraged all our panelists to be as participatory as possible. We welcome your questions. You can put them in the Q&A, you can put them in the chat. We will be monitoring both and working with our presenter today to make sure that they get answered. And we hope that you will take an active role in this summit, again, not just listening, but also participating, asking questions, and planning for yourselves on how you plan to use this information in your own work, in your own lives, and how you can increase your civic participation for good in our society as we go forward. Something that the United States has needed more of from all of our voices for a very long time. So thank you again, and with that, I would like to turn this over to Shawn. Shawn, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Kimberly, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to be a speaker in this really important forum. I very much appreciate it. For everyone else, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation this morning. As was said, my name is Shawn Rochester. I wrote a book called The Black Tax: The Cost of Being Black in America. In that book, I talk about the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Normally, when people talk about discrimination, they tend to look at it from the perspective of the immorality or the injustice associated with it. I wanted to look at it from a different perspective. I wanted to look at, what is the economic cost, associated with that. And so the book is broken into three parts. In the first part of the book, I talk about the costs associated with discrimination in markets that are really critical to wealth accumulation for Black people. So that's the housing and automotive, the finance and insurance that underpin those. It's the job search, it's high-end careers, online commerce, capital raising for businesses, so on and so forth. The second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery up until the present and just really quantify very discriminatory practices that we may or may not have been aware of and put it in terms of what did that mean in today's dollars. The third part of the book, I do a summary of where are we now, and then I introduce an economic framework that I call PhD, which stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit, in ways that create jobs, create and expand businesses, and provide capital within the Black community. The reason why that's really important is because, as you may know, pre-COVID, there were about 2.56 million Black businesses, but only about 4% of those businesses, roughly 109,000 or so, had employees. But that 4% generates about 70% of the revenue, which is close to $100 billion, employs about 1 million people. And we're missing about 1.4 million businesses like that. There should actually be about 1.5 million of those, not 109,000. We were also missing about 6 million jobs across the broader, Black community. And those things combined with the wealth gap are driving almost all the socioeconomic disparities that we're seeing and observing today. So these are, really big problems, right? And as is the case with, effective problem solving, you want to, one second here. Trying to get my slides to fast forward. All right, there we go. I worked on that little snafu all night, just trying to make sure you guys are paying attention. As is always the case with effective problem solving, we need to get a lot of people at the table to be able to work on big problems, right? But the challenge is It's really tough to work with folks if A, people don't see the problem, or if B, people think you're the problem, right? If you would just fix you, right, then we would be great. And there's a couple of platitudes that I'll go through that you guys have probably heard of. One of those is Black people simply not trying hard enough. That has more to do with not getting ahead than any kind of discrimination. We've got over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. You might have heard Black people have the same or better chances as white people to kind of get ahead in America. Over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you might have heard that racism, quite frankly, is an excuse, right, for failure. The failure is mine. Instead of me taking responsibility for it, what I do is spend my time blaming other people for it. You got over 7 in 10, Americans that believe that. So one of the things that's also really critical to effective problem solving is really empathy and understanding, right? To come up with effective solutions, you need to start with a foundation of empathy and understanding. With empathy being just your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, understand things from their perspective, and also understand the pathology, like how did they get to that place in the first place? And then understanding is just how we use data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man. So what I want to share with you is a quote from Albert Einstein. He gave this, said this in 1946 at the National Urban League convention. He said, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination, which by definition is the black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken." So, so in keeping with the advice from Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it. And what I'm going to talk about in the short time that I have with you this morning is, how is it that after 400 years, over 40 million, African Americans own just about 2% of U.S. wealth, right? Either we are consistently and colossally inept, or there's something else going on in the environment that we really need to take a closer and deeper look at, right? So let's do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the time of slavery and kind of just walk forward. And then I'm not going to talk about the horrors of that institution. There have been tombs written about that, but I do want to look at things from an economic perspective, right? And one of the first things that we need to know and understand from this period is that slavery by definition is a 100% tax on your labor. It means that nothing that you produce is yours, right? Not even you are yours. And there are many things from that period of time that we could never value or quantify. You could never value what it is to be a woman and to be able to have no control over your body for the entirety of your life, to be a man and to be unable to protect your loved ones, your wife or your mother, your sister, daughter, so on and so forth. But what you can do is take a look at the value extracted from millions of people over almost a 250-year period, roughly a quarter of a millennium. Now, some economists place that value as high as 24 trillion, others place it close to 97 trillion. If you look at it, if you assume the truth is somewhere in the middle, you can assume that the labor extracted from those folks during that period of time was up to $50 trillion. It's a large number. You might not be familiar with it, but that's not the only thing that we can kind of value from that time, right? So if you go back to 1860, you can look at what is the value of people held in bondage during that time. So there are roughly about 4 million people held in bondage. They are the most liquid asset in the country. They're 50% of the full economic value of the South. They're traded on open markets. There's a price if you're old or young, male or female, able-bodied or lame. So it turns out that the value of those folks is so large that you have to measure it in terms of national income, GDP, or national wealth. So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, it's somewhere between 16 and 20% of US wealth. If you look at it from a GDP perspective, it's 1 to 2 years of GDP. So from a wealth perspective, it's roughly about 15.5 trillion. The question is, how did you come up with that number? At national wealth, going back to like 2016, was roughly 85 trillion. It's more now. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. Take an average of those two, it puts you at 15.5. If you look at it from the perspective of national income, it's 1 to 2 years of national income, which is roughly $28.5 trillion. How do we come up with that number? National income on GDP pre-COVID was 19 trillion. So that would be 1 to 2 years is 19 to 38 trillion. You take an average of that, you're at 28.5. So that's two different modes to be able to value, in today's dollars, the economic impact of those folks. If you take an average of those two, you're at $22 trillion, right? Now, you can also go back to 1939, and Henry Clay in the US Senate estimates that the value of people held in bondage is roughly $1.2 billion. If you look at Thomas Piketty, he says that the return on slave-related investments is 6 to 8%. If we use 5.5%, which is below that range, you're at 24 plus trillion dollars. And if you go back to the 1810s, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison placed the value on people held in bondage at that time at roughly 1 year of GDP, which would be about 19 trillion in today's dollars, or it would require the sale of 1/3 of all public lands in the country. The point here that these are really large, hard to conceive, numbers in terms of the value and impact of these folks. So when you talk about slavery, you're talking about up to $50 trillion. If you think about the economic implication here, right? The net worth of roughly 45 million Black people today is about 1.5 trillion. We just established that 4 million people held in bondage in 1860. It's roughly $22 trillion. The implication there is that means 4 million people held in bondage in 1860 had 15 times more economic value than the net worth of 40 plus million, African Americans today, 153 or so years later. So you could say, wow, those are enormous numbers. I wasn't familiar with those, but that was a really long time ago, and people have had time to progress and accumulate resources since then. And yeah, you would be correct. It is some time ago. The problem is that those people left bondage with no economic resources. We've all heard about, 40 acres and a mule. We know that was not distributed. We've also heard about something called the Homestead Act. What I thought would be interesting to do is to really value those in today's dollars as best we can and juxtapose the two next to each other. So if you look at, 40 acres and a mule, great question is, what would that be worth today? So you're talking about roughly, kind of 160 million acres, which is a hard to conceive, number. If you look at the price of acreage, it's somewhere between, $3,020 and $6,350 per acre. Again, these are farm acres. These are not, Boston acres or New York City or Bay Area or Miami type acres. This is just kind of farmland, valuation. So if you do quick math, it puts that about $1 trillion, generating about $90 billion a year. That never occurred. And while $1 trillion sounds like a lot, it's only 2% of the value extracted from those people and their ancestors, prior to that. Now, if we look at the Homestead Act, which was actually distributed, right? So in 1862, Congress passes an act called the Homestead Act, where they would proceed to distribute 246 million acres to about 1.5 million white families over the next 60 years, right? If you kind of value that using the same kind of mechanism, it's about, on the high end, about $1.6 trillion. So a little more than $1 million per family. Now, all about hardworking bootstraps, but $1 million per family is a hell of a bootstrap. The question becomes, well, what is the Homestead Act and kind of how did it work at a high level? And what the way it worked is you had about the opportunity to claim roughly 160 acres. And if you were so fortunate to be able to claim that, if you stayed on that land for 5 years, at the end of that time, you could take possession of it. Now, if you were an immigrant coming from, Europe, and you were so fortunate to be able to claim, one of those lots, not only at the end of 5 years could you take possession of the land, but also at that time you could naturalize. So you could become a citizen and take possession of that land. So it's a tremendous and extraordinary, economic start, right, in a new land. Researchers say that there are about 93 million white Americans that are direct beneficiaries of this massive giveaway. So this direct, not secondary, tertiary, or affected in some kind of way. If we can kind of fast forward a little, right, and we think about the Civil War, if you fast forward past 1865, Southern economy is devastated. The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated during the Civil War is given back to the white planter class in the South, and there is a massive need for cheap, abundant labor. Now, I just fast forwarded past through a bunch of stuff, so I'm just going to circle back and just elaborate on this a little more. So when we say the global cotton market is devastated, we need to understand that, you know, the cotton market was the first global industry, truly global industry. It was the equivalent of oil today, right? About 20 million people were employed in that around the world. About 1 million of those folks lost their job because of the Civil War. It created something known as a global cotton famine. Accounted for 61% of U.S. exports. The U.S. dominated 80% of the market globally. The cotton famine, because of the Civil War, affected everywhere. It affected, you know, Egypt and India and Europe, of course, and pretty much all of the industrialized nations was built around cotton. So the world, you know, at that point is crying out for what is America going to do to put her newly free people back to work, right? And the answer to that is this construct called Jim Crow, right? And the question is, well, what is Jim Crow? Because it's amazingly nondescript. And what it is a system of laws and customs reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence that was designed to reimpose a 100% tax on sharecroppers' labor. Now, I know that this sounds hyperbolic, right? A 100% tax. And you might be saying to yourself, yes, I know these people were poor, right? Poverty is not a new thing, but surely they had some resources left over. And I'll let you decide, you know, whether or not it was 100% tax. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, sharecropping and what it is. So after the Civil War, those large mega plantations were broken into smaller lots. You know, newly freed people, emancipated people would agree to settle on those lots, excuse me, to plant cash crops. And in exchange for doing so, at the end of the harvest, they would share in a portion of the crop, right? So it's sharecropping. Now, the thing that you need to understand is it was, you know, it was a legal agreement, right? And within that construct, you know, all the terms and conditions are set by the small white farmer, right? And some of those terms and conditions say that if you fell ill, they had the right to outsource your labor to someone else and then charge you back for it. You know, so, and here's part of the challenge. So those people left bondage with no real economic resources. And a harvest doesn't come tomorrow. It comes at the end of the season, at the end of the year. So between now and then, that white farmer has to provide them with food and shelter and seed and fertilizer and the tools, everything that they need really to bring that crop to harvest. And they're doing it at rates as high as 70% per year. So in effect, they control your cost structure, right? Now, here's the thing that we all need to understand. At the end of the season, when you bring those crops to market, that white farmer is the market. He tells you what your crops are worth. So if a person controls your cost structure, your expenses, and they control your income or your revenue, by definition, they control your profit. So I think you see where I'm going with this 100% tax. So if you're fortunate, your profit will net to zero at the end of the year. If you're unfortunate, because they don't want you to go to someone else who might be more generous, they will make sure that your profit is negative. Your costs will outweigh your income, and then they will roll that over into the next year, and now you get into perpetual debt servitude, right? So I know what you're thinking here, which is, Shawn, that's a horrible deal, right? I would never take that deal, and I agree with you. But if you decide to not take that deal, they have a law for that, and they're called bankruptcy laws. And those laws state that if you cannot prove that you're a landowner or that you're gainfully employed, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in state or county jail, right? So you might rethink it and decide to sign a contract and say, you know, upon reflection, it's still a horrible deal. It's just not going to do the work. But if you do that, they have laws for that. Those are called contract enforcement laws. And they say that if you break that labor contract, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in state or county jail. And if you decided to just go to jail and just sit there and have 3 square meals a day, then they could let you out. Eventually, they have something for that. And that's called convict leasing, which means that they will lease you back to the very same small white farmer or to a private corporation that you didn't want to work for, you know, under those conditions. Now, one of the things that's really, really important to understand when it comes to convict leasing is that there's one aspect of it that you can argue is even worse than slavery. And it's in this respect, which is while a slave owner will kill you, or beat you within an inch of your life, slaves were expensive. And they'd much rather have you around for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years, so on and so forth, to maximize their return on investment. But so they have something that's known as an interest in your residual value, right? Under convict leasing, they have no such interest. They only care about what you can do in the 6, 8, 18 months period that you're with them, that you're under lease. They have no interest in your life beyond that. So under those conditions, you've got mortality rates that are approaching 50%. That's a 1 in 2 chance, of death. And while that seems and is quite draconian, it's also very lucrative. So if you go back to 1914, state of Alabama, 20% of their revenue is coming from convict leasing alone, right? So, and you might say, well, normally we go through difficult times, right, as a country, and you come out on the other side, right? But this was not a 3-year period or a 4-year period or even a 10-year period, right? That was a dark period. This thing lasted for about 75 years, right? Roughly between 1870 and 1945, during which about 4,000 Black people were lynched, right? That's publicly executed by their fellow citizen, which is the equivalent of 1 Black execution per week for 75 years, right? And no one's been prosecuted for these things. So, under those conditions, I mean, you get the hint, right? Nobody is coming to save you. Your community gets it, your church gets it, your family gets it, everyone gets it. And when you really start to look at this, you're in a situation where you are dealing with a 100% tax on your labor and no ramifications and recourse whatsoever. So which by definition is slavery, right? Which is why people call this period slavery by another name. And if during the period of slavery, which lasted for roughly 250 years, $50 trillion was extracted. And this period lasted for 75 years, roughly a third of that. And in 1860, you got 4 million people in the fields. And by 1935, you still have almost 4 million Black people working in the fields. You can argue that another 15 trillion was extracted during this, period of time. So if you think about this, upon emancipation and the consequences of the Civil War, the white power structure in the South loses about $22 trillion. But over the next, 75 years or so, they would claw back about $15 trillion of that from newly freed people and their descendants. So now you might say, listen, not everyone was in the Jim Crow system. A few people did get an education, and education is the great equalizer. While it's technically true that not everyone was under the Jim Crow system, and some people did get an education, this is true. W.E.B. Du Bois got an education from Harvard, in the early 1900s, right? And that education is the great equalizer. But here's the challenge. The white planet class really wasn't interested in the expansion of public education. Certainly small white farmers were for their children, and absolutely newly freed Black Americans were critically interested in expanded public education for themselves and their children. But what those farmers needed, or white farmers needed, was a cheap, massive, readily abundant, education. They were not interested in that for newly freed people. So they needed the assistance of small white farmers. So they agreed to support the expansion of public education, but they would divert resources from Black children to white children. If you look at Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, he says in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments has fully repaid any investment, right, that the white Americans made into the education of Black people. If you look at the words of Thomas Logan, who is a former Confederate general and an industrialist, he says, when the freedman regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental work, he is unwilling to accept manual labor, right? So the development of the mind makes people not interested in manual labor. They have no interest in developing the mind. If you go to 1914, William H. Baldwin, who's the president of the General Education Board, think about the Department of Education before the Department of Education, said that the South needed Negroes educated so that they could become the best possible laborers. With the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs, and that will open up opportunities for Southern workers to do the more expert labor. By the way, in pre-emancipation, most of the craftsmen in the South were all people held in bondage, right? You go to 1917, you'll see that there are about 64 public high schools in the South for Black students, right? Again, this is not in a region, in a district, in a state. This is across the South, right? Minimal investment. And most of the schoolhouses were built and owned by Black people. Naturally, many of these were just appendages to churches and church facilities. If you go to 1920, New York City public school system is spending 50 times more per pupil than North Carolina is spending on Black students in a segregated school system. For every dollar in the South spent to educate a Black student, 5 to 8 are spent to educate a white child. It's not rocket science. If you do that with your own children, one will be impoverished, one will go to Harvard. Black teachers in the South are receiving 25 to 34 cents on the dollar, as compared to their white teaching peers. And then white students, of course, are receiving 50% more years of education by the time they're age 25. So if we look at Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, he said this in the early 50s. He said that in the last 40, 50 years, Negroes have advanced little relative in occupational hierarchy, right? You don't have the development of human capital, more factories, more janitors, not more managers, not more salespeople, not more technical skill set. So researchers say that, Black children have just been educated the same. You kept the discrimination in the marketplace, but just educated, invested in children the same. That could have cut the earnings gap between Black and white people by as much as 50%, right? So when you think about that over, a generation, in today's dollars, that's over, $600 billion. If you think about that over the 90-year period for which that is happening up until, 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, that's over $3 trillion, right, lost because of the lack of human capital development when it comes to Black children and adults. Now, you could say, listen, back in that time, you didn't need a super duper education to do well, right? We all, have stories about a great, a grandfather, great grandfather who had a second or third or fourth or fifth grade education, but a strong work ethic, and built a home and did some great things, right, for his family, because, housing is critical, right? And home ownership is critical, which is absolutely true. Is part of the American dream. The country takes it extremely seriously, and it invests accordingly, right? So if you look in the early part of the 20th century, the federal government provided over $120 billion worth of subsidies into home ownership, right? It's about equivalent to $1 trillion a day. It's effectively creating the mortgage as we know it and ensuring payments of citizens so that they could afford homes, so on and so forth. The challenge here is that less than 2% of that went to Black Americans, while over 20 million Europeans who migrated to the US benefited heavily from this after they naturalized, right? So, I'm sure we all know about the FHA and redlining. I won't go through that. But we'll just say that the federal government created the mortgage as we know it. It underwrote, guaranteed the payments of Americans, except it didn't do that for Black Americans. Financial institutions would not lend, to Black Americans. If you wanted to go to a developer directly, they wouldn't sell to you directly. Real estate agents would recuse themselves from those types of transactions, and residents would sign covenants amongst themselves saying, if you move from here, you are required to sell the home to a person who's Caucasian of European descent, right? So it's just a total phalanx that's preventing Black people from being able to, participate in communities with, higher resource levels, right? So what we can say quite definitively, though, is between 1930 and 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the nation went to African Americans. I mean, this is a draconian number, right? Real estate housing is about 64% of the portfolio of African Americans. Is incredibly important to every family. The rise of the real estate market is one of the greatest wealth creation vehicles that has occurred in human history, and Black people were largely unable to participate in a full sense. So just because you can't afford a mortgage, by the way, doesn't mean, or you can't attain a mortgage, doesn't mean that you don't want a home. So people turn to the private markets under something called contract sales, where there's no appraisals required. So people are selling homes at 2x the price. You have, very draconian interest rates. But the worst aspect of private sales are that you don't actually earn any equity, right, as you make installment payments, which means, like, if we agreed that I would take possession of a home after I pay you 100 installment payments, and I paid 99 and missed the 100th, that you could keep my down payment, keep my payments, evict me, and then resell the home to someone else, right? Very, very draconian. In areas like the greater Chicagoland area, which is a huge area for migration of Black people, it's estimated that 85% of all real estate transactions during the 50s occurred through this structure of private sales. So very difficult to accumulate wealth. It turns out that rent within these kind of, urban ghettos, Black communities, was more than 50% higher than outside of it. Upon first look, that doesn't seem to really make sense. But what you have to remember, you've got a migration of Black people fleeing terror in the South. Over a course of many decades, over 6 million people migrate. They're unable to move into better resource communities, and they're corralled into these inner city spaces. So when the desire, the need for housing is going up faster than the amount of housing, what happens? The price of that housing goes way up. So it's actually even more expensive to live in these areas than it is to live, outside of it. Very difficult to accumulate wealth. And then in 1968, the Federal Trade Commission did a study, and they found that goods and services that are sold within these Black communities are 3 times more, right, than what those same things cost outside the community. Again, very difficult to accumulate wealth. And if you just said, just hunker down and work hard, we'll get through this period, in the workplace, in the labor force, you have massive levels of discrimination. Researchers place that discrimination at 1.6 trillion, and it's 1983 dollars, which, if you put in today's dollars, would be well over $4 trillion. So when you think back to some stats that you might have heard, one being this, that, white Americans born between 1943 and 1951 would go on to accumulate 11 times more wealth than Black Americans born during that same time. We've been told that that's all about decisions that people make or not make. It's about hard work, determination, stick-to-itiveness. But the data and history and the pathology would say there's actually far more going on there, right? And we were led to believe. So when you think about housing and labor, you're talking about extraordinary numbers. Won't have time to go through the New Deal and the GI Bill, or interstate highway build out, or what has transpired from the civil rights era up until the present. All of this is covered in the book, The Black Tax, which I encourage you to read. One of the things we can do right now is just kind of take a quick look at where are we, right? And the Black community is missing about $1.5 trillion in revenue. $1 trillion of that is business revenue associated with those businesses that are not in place, and $500 billion is associated with consumer income. We talked about the massive gap in wealth. It's actually well over $8 trillion. That number is underestimated. And then we talked about the missing jobs in businesses, 6.4 million businesses. These are pre-COVID numbers. These have been greatly exacerbated over the last several months. One of the things I saw from my research was this number that keeps coming up, and I call it like the 2% paradigm or rule, which is in areas that are really critical to wealth accumulation for Black people. We tend to hover or participate at a 2% level, right? So if you look at all corporate supply chain spend, less than 2% of that is spent on Black enterprise. Again, I'm not talking about minority, diversity, inclusive spend. I mean on Black enterprise specifically. Less than 2% of all government's supply chain spend, and that's at federal, state, local, all the way up and down the chain. It's less than 2%. The amount that African Americans themselves are spending within their own businesses is also less than 2%. Almost all high growth, high compensation areas, Black people tend to hover around a 2% participation rate. And then, of course, Black banks are massively undercapitalized. Only about $4 out of every $10,000 U.S. banking system is in a Black bank, right? Which is problematic to be able to provide liquidity at an affordable rate to businesses, both existing and newly created. Less than 2% of SBA loans goes to Black enterprise. I think the number is 1.6%. And so all of this just creates a very large, negative depressive impact on job creation and business development in the Black community. When I gave a talk at Google, I got asked this really great question, which was, we have a much stronger sense of what the cost has been for Black people, right? Because of the conversation, but could you tell us a little bit about what the cost has been to the country? And I thought that was a terrific question. And I didn't have the answer at the time, and I said that I would think about it, right? And I would let them know what I kind of came up with. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to do another talk there. And this is kind of what I shared with them, which is what I would like to share with you, which is what if Black Americans had been allowed to fully participate in the innovation that drove the economy, right? It's really critical. So if we think about this period that I've just been talking about, it's roughly, 1870 to 1945 period. In addition to being this Jim Crow period, is also the heart of the Industrial Revolution, right? You've got 2.5 million patents are created in the U.S. telephone, light bulb, telegraph, semiconductors, transistors, airplanes. It's the foundation upon which the whole economy right now is built. Out of those 2.5 million patents, only 726 are attributed to Black people. So almost a complete shutout from the innovation system with respect to patent participation. Why is this of really significant importance? Because, if you look at Professor Kortum at Yale, he says patents can be thought of as proportional improvements, right, in productivity. Constant rate of new patents can lead to a constant rate of economic growth. This is empirical and demonstrable. In the data, Brookings Institute says the nation's unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the innovation system of a number of people who might otherwise make commercialize important discoveries. So one of the things I think is really important for everybody to really understand is that talent, skill, capability follows a normal distribution or a Gaussian spread. Fancy way of just saying 70% of people in the middle, 15% tend to be substantially above average, and 15% below. Why is this of particular importance? So one of the questions I had was, what is the size of this 15% that's substantially above? I call it the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group. During this period of time, right? So if you think 1870, there are about 730,000 Black people in this category. That's not the population at the time. That's just at this 15% ultra brilliant. That number grows to 1.3 million by 1900, roughly 1.8 million by 1930. Almost 2.3 million by 1950. And the question is like, what are these people doing during that period of time, right? And again and again and again, it's some form of sharecropping, tenant farming, right? Massive underutilization of skill, potential, and capability. So what if these folks had been allowed to participate, right, in the U.S. Innovation system? What would have happened to patent creation, to GDP, to national wealth? So we would have seen 280,000 more patents, right? We would have seen $2 trillion more in national income. You guys may be aware of a study done by McKinsey & Company that said if you close the wealth gap, it'll generate $1.5 trillion, right, in incremental GDP for the country, on a go-forward basis. And in terms of wealth loss, we're missing about over $9 trillion of wealth because of the exclusion of these people from this innovation process. A researcher from Michigan State did a really interesting study. She said, what would have happened to innovation if white Americans had experienced a level of trauma, right, that Black people experienced from this Jim Crow period? And her research said that basically about 40% of the patents would have never been created. So 40% of 2.5 million is roughly 1 million patents. Could you imagine how many of these patents we could afford to lose and what that would do to the economy? Well, if that had transpired, GDP would be, almost 8 trillion less, and we'd be missing about $34 trillion of wealth. So the cost, the significance, right, to Black people is draconian and hard to imagine, but the cost is also massive to the country, right? And if you look at the work done by Gary Becker, Money, Economics to Discrimination, it's very clear that both the discriminator and the party that's discriminated against pay an economic price for the discrimination, right? You see that price was significant for Black people and also significant, for the country. So I'm going to kind of end here with 2 quotes. First is from Mr. Einstein at the same conference back in 1946. And he said, the worst disease under which the society of our nation suffers, in his opinion, is the treatment of the Negro. And we talked a little bit about that during this kind of conversation. And then Emperor Selassie, in his speech to the UN General Assembly in 1963, said that the basis for racial discrimination has been economic, and it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. So with that said, I'm going to pause. We can talk a little bit about solutions, the PhD economic framework, and that minority does not mean Black. Thank you guys very much.
Shawn, I have a couple of questions from the audience, I think, that pertain to the first part of your presentation before we move into solutions. Is it okay if I pose them now?
Sure.
One question is, to whom have you had the opportunity to present this material, which we've talked about a little bit, but the second part is, what was their response, in particular from government officials, legislators, and corporations?
So I've spoken at United Nations and Google and Amazon and Viacom and a number of universities and all over the place. The response is pretty much the same, which is a lot of this information is not known and it's not understood. Right? People had no idea of the enormity of it. They were aware to varying degrees of the practices that occurred, but certainly not to the scale, right? Nor the cumulative effect or the longitudinal effect. And in this presentation, I don't even talk about what's happening right now, which I cover in the book, which people weren't aware of as well. So it's extraordinarily well received. It's designed to put people in the same kind of basis to be able to have productive conversations about how we tackle these problems, on a go-forward basis.
Thank you. The second question that came in, I think, relates to what you're about to speak about now. So I'll just insert this and let you integrate it how you like. Mm-hmm. It says, given what you have presented, what do you believe is the best, most effective way to address the Black tax to assure that future generations of Black individuals and families will not have to bear the brunt of past discrimination?
Yeah, so that's a massive question, right? And we're not going to be able to do that justice in the short time that we have right now. So let me just talk about it in pieces. So the first part of it was, for me, was introducing a framework by which you judge the impact and efficacy of the actions, plans, strategies, and policies that people put in place, right? So when Europeans came to the colonies and decided to break off and start their own country, they created a framework. That framework was called the Constitution. And every action that you do is measured relative to what that framework says. So the framework that I talk about is called this notion of a PhD, right? Purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, business, and provide capital in the Black community. So the first thing is you got to have a framework by which to judge, is this having the kind of impact that we need, right? Because I talked about the gap in jobs, I talked about the gap in businesses, and I talked about the gap in capital. And you cannot get the kind of communities that any of us aspire to be a part of with a gap in jobs, business, and capital. It's simply not possible, nor does it exist anywhere, right? So policies, plans, programs, strategies need to directly have an impact on job creation, business development, and availability and affordability of capital. So the first thing that I lay out is that framework. Once you have the framework in place, now we start to do the real work of what are the plans and policies that we need to look at that can maximize those particular outcomes. So most people are not operating on a framework, so they're doing things that are symbolic but economically non-impactful. So that's the first piece that I talk about. And then in terms of like policy and stuff like that, we can certainly get into a deeper policy discussion.
Thank you, Shawn. That's all I have for now. And while Shawn's setting up his slides, if anyone would like to post their questions in the chat box or the Q&A during the presentation, we'll be able to get those in when Shawn is done with his formal presentation part. Thank you. Whenever you're ready, Shawn.
So can you guys see me, or are the slides still up?
I see you.
Okay, fantastic. So the formal presentation was just completed. Gotcha. And now we're excited to have, and as engaging Q&A as you guys want to participate in.
That's all we have from the audience for now. I am wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about the solutions portion. You mentioned kind of three main pillars of participation: education, housing, jobs, and anything else you'd like to add in there. Anything either from your book, without sharing too much, because I know there's a lot of content in there, or from your previous presentations that you think are interesting solutions to highlight.
Yeah, and what we're doing is really trying to create an infrastructure that's not really in place, right? So you have to create a business infrastructure, because we don't have enough of that in place currently right now, right? So up to 2.56 million Black businesses, only 4% even have any employees. So how do we start to expand and invest in that business infrastructure, right? So one of the things I think is really important, or there's a couple of things need to be done at the same time. One, you need to have resources that are, I think, in pension funds allocated, to more Black asset managers who can acquire companies that can have the scale, size, and scope to effectively participate in supply chain spend, right? 2% of supply chain spend is with Black businesses. And when you get into the larger businesses, the Fortune 500 and the like, you do need a certain type of scale to do that. It's hard to grow into that. So you're going to need acquisition capital to be able to facilitate that. You're going to need working capital to allow those businesses to grow in terms of the contract levels. I think there needs to be incentives for corporations to do more business with Black enterprise in their supply chain. There needs to be significantly more investment made in the K through 12, educational space. When you think about children who are coming from, communities that have a high exposure level to persistent poverty, they're 99% less likely to graduate with a 4-year degree than are people who come from well-resourced, communities. That's 1 in 100, right? That's not attainable for the pipeline that we need to have. We got 8 million kids and Black kids in K through 12, and Black families on average are 10 times more exposed to poverty, right, than white students are. And what does that investment level look like? And how does it change the shape and the architecture, of those things? I think those things are really important. And the way you start to move in that direction is you got to have policies that are stimulative for job creation and business development. In the Black community, specifically. And very often what you have is the redress to these issues winds up being like a minority type initiative, which is great for folks who are not Black, but economically winds up being marginally impactful, right, for Black enterprise and Black communities. So even if you look at like supply chain spend, and you look at businesses with employees, the ones with that level, if you look at, women-owned businesses, they generate about $1.2 trillion of revenue. But if you ask of those, how much of that is from Black women, it's only about 2%. So as you invest in women businesses, which you should do, very little of that is going to get to Black, women businesses, but there's such a small portion of it. Same thing when it comes to, Latino, Latinx businesses. They generate about $380 billion for the ones that have businesses. If you ask how much of that is from Black businesses within that, it's again less than 2%. So if you look at all revenue generated by those businesses, only about 4% goes to Black enterprise. So you need to be very specific in terms of how you allocate resources to get the outcomes that you want. You certainly got to measure things and have a management system that's built around it. You need to have, access to capital. Black businesses pay about 100 basis point more. All things being equal, same credit profile, same everything, right? Than their white peers, puts pressure on your cost of capital, less resources available for employees and reinvestment to the business, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of things that need to be done, both in series and in parallel, to be able to tackle this problem.
Thank you, Shawn. One other question, sort of the same question, but a very different angle on it. For the
Mhm.
folks who are on the phone, we have individuals, we have nonprofit people, members of the public, nonprofit employees. I'm just kind of looking down. If there were one thing that folks could do today, and it may have been attending this session, but if there were one thing that folks could do today to either understand or help reduce the problems, what would you recommend to folks?
To be honest, there's no one thing. If you want to better understand the problem, absolutely read the black tax, right? It was just designed to consolidate years worth of investigation and study into, several hours of reading. Is designed to be transformative, and it is by all feedback. So that's the first thing. You get really up to speed very, very quickly on size, scope, scale of the problem, and how it kind of came to be from an economic perspective. If you want to affect change, you need to apply PhD, which is, to the extent that you can, use your own balance sheet and payroll. You can do business with Black enterprise, right? You can work with Black auto dealers. You can work with Black craftspeople. You can work with, when you buy your home, you can use a Black realtor. You can work with a Black wealth manager, so on and so forth, right? Very highly underrepresented. Those are phenomenal jobs. They're transformative for families and communities. They'll never be outsourced. You don't need anyone's permission to do it. If it's your nonprofit, then you can make sure you hire people from the community in which you are serving, and make sure that you do business to the extent possible with enterprises in that community, right? You get a multiplier effect when you do that, actually. That's what PhD does. It gives you a significant multiplier impact on your efforts. Those are all things that individuals can do. And then you can propagate that thinking within your ecosystems and your spheres of influence, and certainly require that when it comes to politicians as they think about policies to have the biggest impact, right? Which is, to what extent is this going to be stimulative, right, for job creation, business development, and capital availability and affordability within the Black community.
Great. Those are great suggestions. Thank you. We have a question from Roxy in the audience. Shawn, would you share your thoughts on Black history and financial literacy, or the lack of it, in the public schools?
I think there needs to be massive curriculum augmentation. This information is not present in K through 12, right? It's barely present in post-secondary, right, in tertiary education. It's not really present in our major institutions, right? So people are bombarded with images that inform and confirm their biases, and they don't have anything to juxtapose it, right? So the process of education is leading people out of ignorance, right? And we are instructing people on particular functional areas, which is really good at the high levels, but we are leaving people without information and context that would allow them to have empathy and understanding as they kind of work for the best interests of the country. So it just needs to be massive augmentation. Right now, people feel very strongly in their belief systems because everything that they have been told and most of the images that they see confirm their existing, kind of bias levels. So that's the first thing that I would say. The other thing, in terms of financial education, it is critical, right? One of the books that I wrote is called CPR for the Soul, where soul stands for stewardship, ownership, and legacy. It's all about personal financial management. Because of this draconian history, right, that I just kind of talked about, Black people in particular, we're not able to accumulate that reservoir, critical mass of information about personal financial management. So you're continually trying to figure it out, right? That information needs to be institutionalized. It have a massive stimulative effect for the economy, right? Cash flow management, taking advantage of tax deferred savings plans that are there, being able to think about legacy juxtaposed to the short-term stimulus that we get from certain things that we buy, so on and so forth. That absolutely needs to be present. I think it's necessary for everyone, right, in general, to have financial literacy. I mean, I use personal financial management. I don't really love the word financial literacy. Just because you can read doesn't mean you'll read the things that are most impactful for you. But having that integrated into the school system, I think, is is critical. Young people, when they get out of university, if they're so fortunate and blessed to be able to do so, unless they have great guidance, they spend a lot of years trying to figure things out. And by the time they decide, hey, I want to focus on family and home and do all the things that my parents told me about, you could be in your early 30s and you could have lost 10 to 14 years, right? The economic consequences of that could be $1 million. And we simply can't afford that across, millions of young people who are our future.
Thank you, Shawn. We have a question from David. How can the recent protests against police brutality and institutionalized racism be used to make inroads towards economic justice?
Yeah, it actually is making inroads, right? Because what you have is you've seen public grotesque executions of people that were beyond what a lot of folks understood to be the case. It seems patently un-American, right? So there's a piercing of the veil, and there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out and see, what they can do, right? And kind of wrap their heads around this stuff because it's different than what they've been told. And people are moving towards trying to put some economic things in place, right? I thought there was a lot of symbolism in the early reactions, but you have companies that are, I think IBM allocated $100 million or something like that to HBCUs. It might be a combination of AI and supercomputing, right? You have, folks that are putting money towards social justice. You have people that are putting money into, Black enterprise in different ways. So you have some movement, right? That's in that direction more than you would normally have. I think that needs to be, escalated by 10x to 100x. The problem is so massive, right? That many of these things it's like giving $1,000 to $1 million problem or $1 million to $1 billion problem. You're off by 3 orders of magnitude, right? But it is movement in the right direction. The other thing I would say is it's very important that actions be economic, that they be scalable, and that they be specific, right? And what I mean by specific is it's specific to like the Black community in particular. Economic, that it creates jobs, business provides capital, and scalable, that you can clearly augment it in a relatively short period of time to get the maximum benefit out of it.
Thank you, Shawn. We have a question from Evan, again back to the school system. If U.S. history education in our schools included much of what you have spoken about today, what impact would that have? Also, by what means could this change in history lesson content take place?
I think the impact would be extraordinary, and we really need to sit and think deeply about that. On the very surface level, people will have far greater understanding. There are tremendously high bias levels within the American electorate, right? So if you look at studies done by Stanford and Michigan and a bunch of other places back in 2012, explicit bias, I know exactly what I'm doing, was measured at 51%, right? Implicit bias, which is unconscious, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm still having an impact, was about 56%, right? So you're well above 1 in 2 Americans, right, in the electorate that have an anti-Black bias, right? Both conscious and unconscious. That plays itself out in a myriad of ways that have enormous economic impacts. So if it was properly, integrated into the school system, it would absolutely reduce the level of certainly of explicit bias, right? When it comes, because people have a greater understanding of the history. Right now, people think that the situation that Black people are in is largely because of the actions Black people have taken or not taken, right? And until they decide to fix that, then why should anybody else decide to fix it? It's completely 180 from what actually happened and transpired. So that would be critical. It would dramatically reduce, I think, explicit bias levels for certain, and it would reduce the rate of growth of implicit, bias. And that would allow for greater wealth accumulation to happen with Black people. Your ability to accumulate wealth is directly proportional to the amount of discrimination that your group is going to face, right, in America. And it just affects everything. It affects jobs of all kinds, right? Doctors, lawyers, actors, craftspeople. People have acted in very explicit discriminatory ways towards Black people. That's had a huge, economic impact. How would you go about doing it? I mean, you could start simply by just adding supplemental reading to what's already there. And that's what the Black tax is designed to do and be. But more formally, there clearly needs to be the development of curriculum, right? That can then be provided to districts, across the country. And I think what's really important to know is that, the idea people are operating on is, somebody's gain and somebody's loss, right? And actually discrimination is anathema to capitalism, right? It reduces commerce. It's actually bad for capitalism. What you want to do is to be able to develop people to their fullest extent and help them to deploy that skill set. It actually makes the pie bigger. And that's one of the things that people need to understand, regardless of your belief system, from an economic standpoint, from the, discrimination is bad for business. It's bad for commerce, right? And to develop people and to allow them to deploy their skill set is actually great for business. So you need to be able to develop skills. You need to be able to deploy it, especially when you don't get to make the decision about whether or not you get accepted to that school, you get placed in the right roles, you get, the right mentorship, you so on and so forth. It could have a very, very significant effect, and it can be easily addressed.
Thank you, Shawn. That quote, "It makes the pie bigger," is one that I want to keep with us and think on that for a while. A related question comes in from David. I think it relates to the question that you just addressed, and relates to the question of how we teach history in our schools, but perhaps you have other thoughts to add as well. Considering that we are supposedly in a time of racial reckoning, which is suspect to this questioner, do you think that most white Americans, are really prepared to accept true economic justice and equality? How can the recent protests against police brutality and institutionalized racism be used to make inroads towards economic justice and equality?
So a couple things. The first thing is you don't need to convince everyone, right? Because the ability to affect the policy execution, the allocation of resources is asymmetric. There's a small group of people who largely have a disproportionate ability to do that, right? And most people kind of follow what's actually happening. So you do need a critical mass of people in general and of folks in position with authority. So we should relieve ourselves of the burden of feeling that we need to convince, everyone. Many people will come along as they see the results kind of playing out. What you do need to do is to expose people to the information. It's very difficult, to jump into solutioning when people do not see the problem that you see, and they don't see it to the extent that you see. Right? So as an engineer and a strategist and a person who spent a lifetime just working on problems and whatnot, this is not a remarkable statement. The first thing is to really understand the system, how it responds to you, how it evolved, and exactly what is happening so that you can better design solutions. So the first thing is we have to actually expose people to the information. Now, that can be through certainly needs to be institutionalized within curriculum, and it certainly needs to be part of broader conversations, right, that are happening, that's on the media and other channels, so people get exposed to the information. There's a ton of people who don't know this stuff, right? Yes, there are the intransigent, right, and that's a smaller group of people that can have a really big impact, but a lot of people have no idea, yet they are very passionate in their positions, yet they feel fully justified in their positions, and yet they feel like things are being taken away from them and nothing was actually given to them. All of that is driven by an absence of knowledge. They have no idea. It's just not the story that was told to them, right? So I think part of it is being able to present people with the information, right? And then giving people the paths to take to be able to execute on those that now believe in taking action when it comes to social justice. So now how does policy reflect this new belief system in social justice or economic justice? right? How are corporations aligning themselves to bring this to fruition? How are nonprofits positioning themselves to bring this to fruition, right? And what I offer, so it's first is exposing people to the information. The second thing, in my view, is giving people a framework to judge the efficacy of their actions, which is this kind of PhD framework, right? And then the third is, we need a ton of policy that brings this about, and then information that helps people see that this is actually better for everyone, right? Because they believe conscious and unconsciously the opposite.
Thank you, Shawn. The next question relates to Black youth, and I'm going to start off with the quote that the questioner put here. Mm-hmm. He says, Carter G. Woodson said, "In the schools of business administration, Black people are trained exclusively in the psychology and economics of Wall Street and are therefore made to despise the opportunities to run ice wagons, push banana carts, and sell peanuts among their own people. Foreigners who have not studied economics but have studied Black people take up this business and grow rich." So the question is, what do you think is the implication of the Black youth uninterestedness in focusing on less economically lucrative ventures, like developing communities, mom and pop shops, instead of making headwinds in corporate America? Is there any information to confirm this, or was Woodson wrong?
Yeah, so there's so many parts to this question that I may not do justice, because there's many different parts of it. The idea that there's a failure of Black youth doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if you ignore the impact of environment, which is not possible, because we are all products of our environment. The biggest determinant to your success is your environment. It isn't you. It's tons of smart people, right? Whether or not you get developed to your fullness, and whether or not you get the ability to deploy, whether or not your resources, your environment has the resources to allow all that to happen, has everything to do with it, right? So the first thing you can't isolate Black youth and be like, well, you're not making the right decisions. The first thing is to look at the environment under which those youths are growing up, and that will lead and predict the decisions that they would make. By the way, if you took Black youth out of that environment, you put anybody else in there, you're going to get the same exact outcome, right? So the idea of kind of isolating Black youth, right, is just it's a consistent way of thinking. It's a normal way of thinking. Like, the problem is a Black problem. It's not really to do with the environment, but it's kind of 180 from what is actually happening. The second thing is the vast majority of Black youth are living, or disproportionately higher proportion of Black youth are living in hyper impoverished communities. Now, we know that impoverished communities in general, it's nothing to do with race, tend to be less civically engaged. They tend to be focused much more on the now and not on the future, because they're trying to make as much as they can with kind of what they have. They don't have the same exposure to success, right, that other groups have, kind of, so on and so forth. So there's that piece of it that's kind of echoing from what I heard, kind of read. Then there's a piece about kind of what business schools are teaching, which is, business schools teach, and I've been to amongst the finest, right, in the whole world. They teach about free market capitalism, all that kind of stuff. And markets were never free when it came to Black people. It's simply not true. Like, you had an irrational response if you were Black. It's called deterministic in terms of statistics, which meant the outcome was predetermined, which is, we don't do business with you. It is independent of your skill, your capability, so on and so forth, right? So none of that is ever kind of discussed, right? Within business school, you'll learn about how options were created, and farming, all that kind of stuff, and asset-based stuff. But you'll never learn that asset-based lending started with Black bodies, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that's left out there that leaves out context, right? The idea that markets are rational is demonstrably not so. anti-Black bias plays an enormous role in the actions that people take, and so does automatic white preference, right? And those things aren't really studied and or kind of discussed. The second piece of it is, you know, Black people, youth, adults, or whatever, need to participate in business at all levels. They need to participate in business when it comes to the trades, right? They need to participate in businesses that you would see on Main Street. They need to be higher participation levels in startup type of technologies and cultures. And then in mainline older school business, there's this massive underrepresentation kind of across the board, right? You don't have to choose one or the other. We need to have greater representation kind of across the board, because communities are built up of all these things. And then, you know, the other piece is you Black communities, you've normally had, you know, Europeans as the makers of the end products, right? And then you've had, you know, non-Black, non-white intermediaries that are sitting between like Black communities and kind of white manufacturers and producers, right? And they have more availability to capital and all that kind of other stuff. So it's not Black people opting out of things, right? You got to remember there's you know, you've got a 100-year process where you were unable to participate, right? In the first, you know, 50 years post slavery. I mean, you could be killed for applying the American dream, right? You were not allowed to participate at various universities, regardless of your skill set. You know, these mortgages that people didn't get, these weren't handouts. These were people who actually were qualified for the mortgage. They didn't get it, right? There are people who were qualified to go to all these different schools, and they were not allowed in, right? Or extremely low token levels. So we got to have kind of a broader kind of conversation. Like I get what Mr. Woods is talking about, if that quote accurately reflects, you know, what he was said, but there's just many different parts of that you kind of have to look at. It's kind of like the Du Bois Washington argument, right? Which is, do you kind of focus on industrial type education, or do you go and you get a college degree that deals more with the, that development? And the answer is you need both, right? It's not one or the other. You need both. They're complementary and reinforcing.
All right, excellent. Thank you for elaborating on all the many points that were in that question. We have a question coming from Disha. This refers back to your wonderful quote a few minutes ago, Shawn, about growing the pie.
Mm-hmm.
So Disha says, hi, what are your suggestions to tackle people, I assume she means address people, who have zero-sum thinking, who oppose cultural empowerment programs?
So there's something called the principle implementation gap, right? Where people agree with you in principle, but they oppose you in implementation, right? So, and we have to separate that group. Again, I think you should waste no time on the intransigent. Those are people who are fully committed to their positions, and they are impervious to new information, facts, and information, right? Such people exist. You do not want to spend your time there. There are a bunch of folks who will oppose things, right, because of what they know, but they will be open to considering things that might be different than what they understand and become legitimate to them. And we have to give those people an opportunity to be confronted with information that is different than what they understand, because they feel very, very justified in it, right? So to me, like, the first part is the education that has to happen, you know, within that group. You're under no burden to convince, you know, everyone. People who are not interested can self-identify, and then, you know, they can be addressed and dealt with accordingly. The people who are open to information can be presented with that information, and those who want to take action, we need to provide pathways for them to be able to take action. We should provide, you know, incentives, right, for the actions that we want, and disincentives for the type of behavior that is not helpful. The fact of the matter is the pie is bigger and it does grow, regardless of what people think, but we can help educate people to know that that's actually the case, right? You know, so that's what I would say at a high level. That's not one homogenous group. There's actually the intransigent, and then there's those who don't have access to the information, who might otherwise be willing to consider other things being more helpful or less resistant, right? Because they feel very justified in their positions, you know, right now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shawn. Thank you many times over for lending us your expertise and your valuable time that you spent here today. That is the end of the questions. I'm just going to give a 2-minute wrap up and logistics stuff here again as we are moving into the whole overall summit. If people do still have questions for Shawn while we're on the line the next 2 minutes or so, please feel free to type them in the chat box or the Q&A. First of all, again, many, many thanks to Shawn. I want to remind everyone that in addition to Shawn authoring a book called The Black Tax, he has authored at least one other book that we know of. It is available for purchase. I'm putting the promo in here, Shawn, so you don't have to. So lots and lots of information, including the data that Shawn discussed here today and much more. So we encourage you to support Shawn in that. If you are interested in having Shawn speak at another event or working with your organization, corporation, bank, or whatever, you can contact him through me at any time, and obviously you can find him directly on social media, etc. Our next session is at 2 p.m. this afternoon. We are going to continue our discussion of the data on the understanding piece of the Understanding Racial Inequalities theme of this conference. This afternoon's session will focus specifically on access to banking services by Black and Brown communities and the disparities there. That will be at 2 p.m. this afternoon. And as far as logistics go, for those who are currently on, you know that we sent out a link and a reminder this morning for this session. We will be sending out a link for this afternoon session right around 12:30 p.m. So hopefully it will be at the top of your boxes. And that's it for this Tuesday's program. We reconvene next Tuesday and all Tuesdays in October with a set of wonderful speakers, wonderful topics as we continue to explore these issues, flesh some of them out, dig into very specific topics. Thank you everyone who attended for your great questions. I hope that you learned a lot. We really appreciate your engagement, and I'm looking forward to seeing you throughout the rest of the session. We have thank you that came in the chat. Thanks for a great session, Shawn, from attendees, and thanks from Midas. Appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day, guys.
Bye-bye.